I'm Dr. Duke with the New American, and I'm really pleased to be joined today by Dr. Paul Jehle. Dr. Jehle is the president of Plymouth Rock Foundation. He is also the senior pastor at New Testament Church in Plymouth, Massachusetts. You have two books, Dr. Jehle, that I think it would be really interesting for our audience to know a little bit about. One is called Journey of Faith, Why the Pilgrims Came to this country, and Plymouth in the Words of the Founders. So here we are in 2020, and with every Thanksgiving that goes by, in the last 5-10 years, we hear more clamor from the outrageous secular left that Thanksgiving is a sham holiday, that
Sure.
we've
Yeah.
seen Columbus Day replaced informally with Indigenous Peoples Day. Well, help us set the record straight a little bit. Talk about your experience as somebody who lives this history every day based on where you live. Give us a sense of what the real meaning of Thanksgiving is, and the Pilgrims in general, 1620. Tell us what the significance is.
Well, of course, when the Pilgrims came, we often tell people that really New England is founded by a church plant because this was a small church in Leiden, Holland. It had grown to be over 300 people. They had been through the fire already. They had been persecuted in England, of course. Some of their friends died in the Tower of London. They knew that the price for their conviction of beginning a church as the New Testament instructed them, wherever two or three are gathered together, there am I in the midst of them, Jesus had said. So they figured, hey, we can start a church without the permission of the bishop, without the permission of King James. And of course, they knew that would be costly because even when they formed their own covenant and church in that way, after many of them had been converted through the revival known as the Reformation, that they realized they added this, whatsoever it should cost them. And of course, that it cost them something, as Bradford wrote, this ensuing history will declare. So here this into Holland with some toleration of religious freedom, very different than religious liberty, but that toleration was a whole lot better than what they had in England. That church grew to over 300 people. And yet only about 75 had chosen to go into the wilderness to start a new church. So this was a church plant. And the most important thing to recognize is they came very cognizant of the fact that they had to come with different motives than explorers had gone before. The Papal Bull of 1452 had overshadowed all European explorations of taking people's lands, committing genocide, making them slaves, and then introducing Jesus or introducing Christianity, which was an oxymoron. Obviously, it was crazy because the methods did not match the message. And they knew, and they were very cognizant of this. And so they came seeking peace with the natives. They came, of course, no experiment and no time you bring two cultures together will it be perfect. You're gonna have friction, you're gonna have difficulties, and that certainly was the case. But for a small colony and a group of like this to come in, and they weren't all Christians that were here, at least not all part of the same church. And it's amazing that they were applying the teachings of their pastor. Pastor John Robinson was known, he trained his congregation, not just in devotional life in their walk with God, but how to set up a commonwealth, how to set up a civil government, how to set up an economic system, how to set up a commonwealth and a culture that would reflect biblical values. So they were not coming over here merely to escape something. They came over here with a goal. In fact, Bradford put it this way, they were here to advance the gospel of the kingdom of Christ in remote parts of the world. Yea, though they would be stepping stones unto others for the performing of so great a work. They were not just coming for themselves either. They knew, look, you don't get on a boat in 1620 and go on vacation. You're not going for some ride someplace. The fact that they brought 24 family units, women and children, was unheard of at the time. And native historians have recognized that because they came with women and children, they knew they weren't coming to conquer. Because you recognize that when they would come, they were coming to stay. And they were coming to stay and attempt to get along with others and live in peace. And this is what their pastor had taught them. So here they were living out their theology. That's why they created the Mayflower Compact. Because when they were blown off, people were to give speeches of mutiny. They had to bring people, stranger, and the English in that church, their Leiden congregation. How were they going to do that? They did it the same way they did within their church. They formed a covenant with the highest common denominator, the greatest maximum unity. Unlike today, we like to focus on all the differences. They focused on what was harmonious, what was unifying, how could they get along? And it was a shock of all shocks because You had a state church in England where King James claimed to be head of the church, and the civil government would enforce religious beliefs. Well, everybody knew that in history, you swing a pendulum from one extreme to the other. It's so common throughout history. And I'm sure the people on the boat who were not part of it were saying, hey, I know what they're going to do. If we're outside this patent, now we're going to be ruled by the church. We're going to have a church state. You're going to have to be a member of the church in order to vote and all that thing. And instead, they enshrined the rule of law. Everyone had an equal vote, an equal say. Every male at that time representing their families or themselves would have an equal say in the formation of law. Way ahead of their time. Why was it ahead of their time? Because they were using biblical principles to set up their civil government. And with that, they began to, so all these things are precursors. Think about it. They found on the ship. Then only 4 months later, they had a peace alliance with the natives in March of 1620. Then in August of 1621, they had an opportunity to have a reconciliation service where they actually apologized for the conduct of Thomas Hunt, who 6 years before had stolen 22 natives, turned them into slaves, took them over to Europe. Squanto was one of them, the Indian that came, because he was operating by that former conquer and conquest genocide philosophy. And here they were able to say, Hunt was a bad man. He shouldn't have acted the way he did. He's disgraced all of England, and we will not act that way toward you. Now, if you don't have this peace on the Mayflower Compact, if you don't have this peace alliance in March of 1621, and have this apology given to natives who had 22 of their own stolen, no wonder they fired arrows at them when they landed on the beach. They were waiting for anybody to come back. Well, if you don't have those, you don't have a first Thanksgiving. You don't have 3 days of feasting, 3 days of recreational, who knows? Most likely they were athletic games at that first Thanksgiving. So athletic goes together. But the point is, you don't have that kind of first Thanksgiving unless you have a culmination of these other aspects. And if the whole told, my concern today with all of the history is people can take any facts that they want, but when it's out of context, out of its historic time period, and you don't tell the rest of the story, you can make history say anything you want. I do that all the time when I deal with in the ecclesiastical realm. I'm dealing with preachers and pastors. Unfortunately, you can make the Bible say anything you want. If you take it out of context and you rip it out of its original time frame and the analogies, you everything. So the idea is, I think if the whole story were told, people would be saying, this is amazing. Half of them died the first winter. Only 4 of the 18 adult women were alive after that first winter. 3 got on board the ship over 6 months pregnant. I mean, you got to have commitment for this. This is no small thing. If you take the whole thing in light of it, the fact that they were so appreciative of the natives who helped them to plant corn and all the rest, you take the whole story, it's pretty remarkable.
It is very remarkable. And since we're on this talking about the history and the abuse of history, my primary job is to be a university professor, and I see this every day. What would you say? I'm 100% behind you. I teach literature. You're obviously steeped in history and church history. But I keep hearing from my students, none of this matters. We do not have to honor the context of racists and future slaveholders. We do not need to, whatever reason the Pilgrims left England, that was white people oppressing white people, why they had to bring this to this country to begin with. They had no reason to do it, no justification for it. How do you get to kids who have been so beaten down with this such one-sided and actually skewed view of what happened?
Well, I think one of the critical things, again, is to share the context of it. They had a missionary call. They believed they were like missionaries coming to the wilderness. There were actually several whole treatises written as to what justification you would have to leave England and go over to the wilderness. And if you were going to oppress people, if you were going to merely put people under, there was no reason to go. In fact, the theologians of that day said it'd be better to stay home. Don't do that. But if you are going to go with the right motive, can you go to improve situation? Can you go to serve people? Can you go with the goal to improve everyone's life? And if that's the case, then there's some positive reason to be able to go and to do something. And that, of course, is part of the Pilgrim story.
And it's incredibly forward thinking and progressive, as you say, from a 16th century, 17th, early 17th century standard. After we come back after the break, I want to pursue that a little bit with you. I want to talk to you in the next segment about how is it that they did eventually, the Pilgrims, begin to impact everyone, not just themselves for the better. I'm Dr. Duke with the New American, and I am joined again by Dr. Paul Jehle, a great expert on the Pilgrims, the founding of this country, the Mayflower. And, you know, this time of the year and this time of our culture, it's a story that we really do need to refocus on. We've got a big threat to the standard narratives of the founding of this nation with the 1619 Project, and I want to talk to you about that. But first, I would like to ask you, in our last conversation, you made a really inspiring comment that the Pilgrims came here fully aware of the fact that they were coming not to take, not to enslave, not to engage in violence. They were coming here as missionaries to make a better lives for themselves, but ideally for a better life for everybody living over on this side of the Atlantic. And within a few years, and the experiences they had, talk a little bit about that's the part of the history that almost never gets taught. What were the positive innovations? What were the ways the Pilgrims interacted with the natives, interacted with the land and the other cultures that did help bring about greater understanding, greater communication, greater love between two different kinds of peoples?
Right. Well, I think obviously if you come with a heart motive to serve, and no one's going to have perfect motives, and in your group you're going to have hotheads no matter how many you have or how few you have. So there were all kinds of issues they had to deal with, like anyone has to. But their primary motive was to come and serve. But it works both ways. I mean, if the natives had not helped them to learn how to grow corn and to use the fertilizer that they knew. This soil was so sandy here in Cape Cod, and the area that they wouldn't grow anyway. If they hadn't learned from the natives, they would not have survived. But not only that, natives learned from the English, because the Pilgrims, they brought hoes and garden equipment that the natives had not seen. The natives brought food the English had never. Look at that first Thanksgiving. We call Thanksgiving today. It was a harvest festival that had gone on for years, both in Leiden and England, that they knew about. And of course, they would thank God for that harvest festival. That was a tradition. But they would also be very grateful for their neighbors. And think about it, to actually have two cultures working together so that you have 3 days of feasting, not fasting. This was not a primary just a religious holiday, although, of course, they would have prayed and would have given thanks to God. And the natives would have great spirit. They were not an irreligious people. But you think if you're going to have friendly competition and you're going to exercise your arms, so to speak, and I sometimes tell students all the time, I teach high school, and when I go through this, I say, listen, if they had a bow and arrow contest, you think won that? Okay, well, the shotgun contest, probably the English were using that. But that takes a lot of trust between two cultures. You don't do that with just any old way, way without building friendship. That led to future areas. They had in 1623 they went against their financial contract, which they were forced into at the having somewhat communal property in agriculture, and they wanted private property. Scriptures, they understood what they wanted, but then it was changed on them. And in order to be able to survive, when not starve to death, they set private gardens behind their home. Well, this really improved a lot of everyone. Bradford said everyone became, they tripled their production. And not only, but they had a drought of 6 weeks, and they ended up calling a fast and Wednesday. And the natives came and said, what are you doing this for? Well, they taught them, this is what God for prayer. We asked God for rain. We prayed, and this is what happened. There was a learning back and forth with the two colonies. In fact, one of the converts, Abamak, built his own village right next to Plymouth Plantation. We had this friendliness. We had the Pilgrims who went and visited Massasoit when he was sick to try to nurse him back to health, to use the herbs that they had learned, whether it was the individual Samuel Fuller, who had been a deacon over there in Leiden, and of course he becomes the doctor over here in Plymouth. He helps them out. They were going to, by their peace alliance, work with each other if they were unjustly attacked. All of these things betters both cultures. See, most people look at it today, we have this plus and minus idea, which is wrong, that every economic transaction, someone's a winner, someone's a loser. But you see, when you follow this and you do it out of a motive for service, everybody's a winner. Both sides are a winner when you barter. Both sides are a winner. And they did that in 1627 with their Patuxet trading post. Here they're trading with the Dutch and the natives, and they introduced currency, a wampum. So you don't have to do barter. You now can introduce a currency. Well, guess what? You know where the wampum comes from? It comes from a quahog shell. Well, who do you think can get out of the riverbed in the muck the quickest? It's natives. The natives with this because they can get the purple and the white, one worth three the other, and they can come in and now buy beaver skins. It improved the economic condition of all those that were trading. That's what free market economics. That was the seed. They didn't have a full free market system yet, but they had this idea of the seeds of this. Where did this all come from? Innovation. They could be innovative across an ocean where they didn't have some bishop or some civil official looking over their shoulder watching every single thing they did. They could now follow the scriptures. They could then walk in peace with others. And this is what makes the Pilgrim story somewhat unique, even more unique than some of the Puritan stories. And we see when murder's a native, now you're going to have a test. Well, when the English make half the jury native, now the natives say, yeah, we are treating us as equal. See, these kinds of things, when you know the history, you can begin to get hope and say, gee, this is powerful. This means not perfect, but it is excellent beginning in our nation. Think again, when the true positive history is, you can begin to see the contrast when people just take facts out of context and then exaggerate the dominant force when they weren't.
It's a great point. And related to that, as we've got a few minutes left, the new big thing now is the 1619 Project, right? It wasn't invented by historians. It was invented more or less by reporters and journalists at the New York Times, of all places. And what it basically is an attempt to eradicate or to discount the history you just told us in favor of a narrative that says 1620, cooperation, missionary work, building a free and liberty-based society. That's not the purpose of America. The purpose of America is slave and slaveholding and enslaving people. How do you just address that? And what is your thought about how the 1619 program is beginning to erase traditional history in our public schools?
Well, I think the only reason it begins to erase it is because we haven't taught anything. In other words, we have been ignoring history and the true history from primary source documents for decades. This isn't anything new. This is a situation where when you don't teach real history, it's like something else. I tell students, the reason I want you to teach this history that you're not going to hear anywhere else, because I run a private academy in our own church, that when you do that, you're going to be able to answer these things when your professors tell you in college, because there's another side to the story that's left out completely. Sure, there were issues that started in 1619. Yeah, Jamestown was not perfect, neither was Plymouth. But the point is, those things are taken out of their context. The rest of the history is ignored. And it's as if that one side is the only side that exists. Think of it this way. The problem we have with debate, first of all, it's no longer taught. Debate, rhetoric, and elocution, and those kinds of subjects are no longer taught. But the idea is, it's like saying, here's one argument, it's the straw man argument, and we're not going to tell you there's another side to the argument. So everybody thinks, oh, this is the part of the history we've never been told. That's not the case. I think, again, context is critical. We don't defend any part of history as perfect. Any event in history is going to have bad things because people are in there. But you have to look at the silver lining and look at the motives and look at the context of it. And then we can learn from history. We are not learning from history often today because history's been changed. It first became social studies, and then it became all kinds of eclectic ideas as if the community is more important than individual productivity or individual thought process or understanding. I think we need to go back to that. And as you know, the 1619 Project is not endorsed by any credible historian. In fact, most historians have said this is crazy, and there's a pullback on it because of that.
No, I agree with you. It's still getting in the schools. Many of the schools are still adopting it. And I like what you said also about the idea that we need to go back to primary text. We need to go back to giving kids context as opposed to the kind of history we were just discussing, this ideologically driven. We start with a set of ideological assumptions that the colonists could only be aggressors, the Pilgrims could only be a hostile force, the natives could only be victims, and then the anti-history writes itself. But we've got about 45 seconds left. Please tell us a little bit about your work, where people can find your information. How can people start joining into what you are up to?
Well, in 2003, I wrote a tour book for the town of Plymouth, and I did it where every monument dedicated to the Pilgrims' memory in Cape Cod and Plymouth, I interpret it with the words of the Pilgrims themselves. I let the Pilgrims interpret that monument. It's called Plymouth in the Words of Her Founders. I also wrote a book this year for the 400th anniversary called Journey of Faith. And what it was is basically to take the faith that they wrote about with using primary sources and articulate how they applied that to every facet of their society, from their exploration to their settlement here all the way up through that first Thanksgiving. And I think people will find that very informative and helping to give the full context of the story.
Dr. Paul Jehle, thank you so much for your time today. We appreciate it.